students. We are discussing the chapter 12 of your book, Light, Shadows and Reflections. Before continuing with our further topic, first we'll revise what we have done in our previous videos. First thing which we have discussed already in this chapter is what is light. What is light? It is a form of energy that enables us to see the things around us. It is the form of energy due to which we can be able to see the things around us, all around us, is known as light. Then we differentiate the objects on the basis of various forms. First one is on the basis of their origin, and those sources of light are of two types. First one is natural source of light. It is the source of light which is made by nature itself. The source of light which exists in nature is known as natural source of light. For example, the sun, the stars, fireflies. These all are the sources of light which emits their light, and they are made by nature. They exist in nature. So they are known as natural sources of light. Second one, the artificial sources of light. The source of light which gives the light, which emits the light, and they are formed by human beings for their well-being, for their use. Those sources are known as artificial sources of light or human-made sources of light. Example are tube light, candle. The burning candle gives us light, and that candle is not made by nature. It is made by the human beings. Burning torch. The torch is also discovered by the human beings. So burning torch is also an example of artificial source of light which gives us light, but that is made by us. That is made by human beings for their well-being. Next differentiation we done on the basis of whether that source emitting its own light or reflecting some other source light. फिर हमने डिफरेंशिएशन किया बच्चे, ये तो था ओरिजिन पर, कैसे पैदा हुए सोर्स, कैसे बनाए गए. नेक्स्ट डिफरेंशिएशन इज ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ how they emit their own light or they are emitting the light of some other source. For example, the first basis, the first form is luminous objects. The objects which emits, which release their own light are known as luminous sources of luminous objects. The sources of light which emits their own light are known as luminous objects. For example, burning candle. Burning candle gives the light of its own. Burning torch. The sun. The stars. These are luminous sources of energy. They give light of their own. The second one which we have discussed was non-luminous, which do not emit their own light. They do not release their own light, they do not produce their own light. Rather than that, they just reflect the light of some other source like tube light, like torch, like sun or the stars, and then that light is reflected into our eyes, and by that reflected light we can be able to see them. For example, this board, chair, table, all these sources are non-luminous objects. They do not emit their own light. They reflect the other sources, the luminous sources light, and by that they are visible to us. The clothes, the human body, all those are non-luminous sources of light. Then we differentiate the objects, the sources, on the basis of either they allow the light to pass through them, they do not allow light to pass through them, or they allow some part of light to pass through them. And on this basis, the objects are of three types. The first one is transparent objects. The objects which allow the light to pass through them very easily, very conveniently. Those objects are known as transparent objects. And as light can be passed through them very easily, the objects placed ahead of them are very clearly visible to us. Example is clean air, clean water, transparent glass. These are certain examples of transparent objects. They allow the light to pass through them very easily. That is why we can see through them. The second one are translucent objects. The objects which do not allow the whole light to pass through them. They allow some part of the light to pass through them. That is, they are partially available for the passage of light. Only a portion, only a partial part of light can be able to pass through them, and those are known as translucent objects. Example, grounded glass. It is a special form of glass. Another example is butter paper, tissue paper. All those are the examples of translucent objects which do not allow the light to pass through them completely. As light do not passes through them completely, the objects are not visible when we see the objects through them. जब बच्चे पूरी तरह से लाइट को जाने ही नहीं दे रहे अपने में से, तो जो इनके ऑब्जेक्ट्स दूर पड़े, इनके पार पड़े हैं बच्चे, तो हम उन ऑब्जेक्ट्स को इनके थ्रू देख नहीं सकते. The third ones are opaque objects. The objects which do not allow light to pass through them at all. They do not allow very small, even a small amount of light to pass through them. थोड़ी सी amount of light को भी अपने में से pass होने नहीं देते बच्चे. Whatsoever the light is, they blocked every part of that light. For example, the wall, the brick wall, clothes, human body, or animal body. These are opaque objects. They do not allow the light to pass through them. Metals, clay, all those sources are also opaque objects. They do not allow the light to pass through them. Next we have this. The comparison of speed of light and speed of sound. There is one question related to this comparison, bache, in your book, and that question is why we see the lightning first and then heard the thunder later on. During a rainy day, thunder and lightning comes struck at the same time, but we see the lightning first and then heard the thunder later on, because the speed of light is quite high as compared to the speed of sound. Speed of light is 3 into 10 raised to the power 8 meter per second. That is approximately 30 crores meter per second. And this is 340 meter per second only. It is in crores and it is only in hundreds. So the speed of light is quite high, is very much higher as compared to the speed of sound. That is why the light reaches to our eyes more early as compared to the sound which comes or which produce at the same time. So for that reason, if light comes, we see it first and then we heard the sound. That is why we see the lightning first and then heard the sound of thunder. Next we discuss the rectilinear propagation of light. What is it? The light always travels in a straight line. That property of light is known as rectilinear propagation of light. So it is the property of light in which, or due to which, light always, the particles of light always travels along a straight line. This property is known as rectilinear propagation of light. After that, we discussed what is a shadow. Shadow is a dark space or a shade formed behind an opaque object because that opaque object stops the path of light. That dark shade, that dark space which is formed behind an opaque object, when it blocks the light from any source of light, or when it blocks the path of light from any source of light, is known as a shadow. There are three conditions required for the formation of shadow. Shadow formation requires three essential conditions. Either one of them is, if not available, then shadow formation does not take place. So those three conditions, those three essential conditions for the shadow formation are: first, an opaque object which blocks the path of light. If you take a transparent object, then no shadow will be formed of a transparent object. Second, a source of light. We discussed an activity as well. If the source of light is not available, then no shadow whatsoever possible is formed. अगर बच्चे source of light नहीं होगा तो shadow form नहीं होगी. And the third one is the screen, which should be and which must be opaque, which do not allow the light to pass through it. Only then a shadow will be formed on an opaque screen. So these are the three conditions required for the formation of shadow. First one is an opaque object of which the shadow is to be formed. Second, a source of light. And the third, an opaque screen on which the shadow is formed. Now we will discuss the characteristics of a shadow. What are the features or what are the characteristics of a shadow that we will discuss in this topic? There are certain features which a shadow follows, and those features will remain fixed for every shadow. The first one, shadow is always dark outline of an object. Shadow never depends either on the color of the object or the color of the light from the source where it is coming. For example, if I am wearing this color shirt, the shadow of this shirt will remain black. If I wore an orange color shirt, then also the shadow will still remains the black. If I'll make the shadow of this white marker, then the shadow still remains the dark, that is the black in color. So shadow is always dark, irrespective or regardless of the color of the object or the color of the light which is falling on the object, which light we are using to make the shadow. Second one is, it only shows the dark outline. It never tells us about the details of the object. Shadow is just an outline. It is not a fixed detailing object. That means it does not tell us about the size, about the features, colors of an object. It just gives us an outline of an object. You can observe this thing. The shadow of a cat appears to be like of tiger. Why? Because their appearance is just like same. So shadow may be misleading sometimes. Next one, shadow is formed in the direction opposite to the source of light. For example, if I am standing here, I want to draw my shadow on this board, then the object must be placed in this side, that is towards the screen, that is towards yourself. So if the object is placed towards your side, then only my shadow will fall on this board. So for the formation of shadow, the source of light must be placed in front of the object and the screen must be placed behind the object. So it is formed in the direction opposite to the source of light. object. Shadow is always formed in the direction opposite to the source of light. Next, the size of shadow depends on two things. The first one, the size of shadow varies depending upon the distance between the object of which we are getting the shadow and the screen. If I stand closer to this board, then the shadow will be very small. And if I come ahead towards the source of light, then the size of the shadow increases. So the size depends on the distance between the object and the screen. So this is the first thing on which the size of the shadow depends, on which the size of shadow varies. First is depending upon the distance between the object and the screen. And the second one, the size of the shadow varies with the distance between the source of light and object. If I come closer, the shadow will become longer, and if I go away from the distance, the size of the shadow changes. So that varies. The first thing is the size of shadow varies with the distance between the object and the screen, and the distance between the object and the source of light. The last one is the shape and size of the shadow also varies with the position of the source of light. Position means whether that source of light is placed here, 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 and here. By these positions, the shadow varies. If the object is here, the shadow will be like this much. If the object is here, the shadow will be like this, and a bit of longer one. You can check this when the sun rises or sun sets. You'll observe when sun rises, then the length of the shadow is maximum. And when during the afternoon the sun is overhead, the size of the shadow is the smallest. So, with the position of the source of light, the size and the shape of the shadow varies. Now we will check that the color of the shadow does not depend on the color of object. If you see the cap of this marker, this is green in color. But if you look at the board, the shadow is black. Shadow is dark, This is the shadow forming here, The shadow is black. So the green colored cap is seen as a black in the shadow. Now I am changing the marker, If you can look closely, this is a somewhat of orange in color. But if you look closely at the shadow which is formed on the board, is still black. So the color is either green or orange, the shadow will still remains the black. If I changes the marker cap to pink, still the shadow on the other side of the board is black. So the color of the black shadow will remain black. Now I changes the cap color to somewhat of purple in color, but still you can easily look at the screen, that is still black. So the shadow of an object does not depend on the color of it. It forms as a dark outline of that particular. Now we will discuss how the size and the shape of shadow varies when we changes the distance. Look at here, the shadow is somewhat of same size of this marker, but when I withdraw it away from the screen, the size of shadow, look at the size of the shadow, it increases. The distance increases, and the size of the shadow is enlarging. If I decreases the distance, it becomes smaller. So it depends on the distance between the object, this object, and this screen. Same is happening when I'm going towards the source of light. Source of light, it's on the opposite side of the screen, and when I taking it nearer to the source of screen, the size of the shadow increases, it varies. And when I am taking it away from the source of light, the size of the shadow decreases. So it depends between the distance of object and the screen, and the distance of object and the source of light. So that's how the size of shadow varies. So the size of Size and shape of shadow depends on the position of the source, distance between the object and the screen, and the distance between the object and the source of light. Now we'll check the position. Now I am placing the source at the top. Look at the shadow. It is very much of smaller. As I am taking it closer to it, the size of shadow increases. My hand is stand still. I am not moving my hand, but the position of shadow varies with the source of light. So that's how the shape and size of the shadows varies with the position of the source. Look at here. So with the position of the source of light, the shape and the shadows varies. Now we will discuss eclipses. Eclipses are also results in the formation of shadow of one body over the other. There are two types of eclipses. The one is solar eclipse, Surya Grahan, and the other one is lunar eclipse, that is Chandra Grahan. Eclipse occurs whensoever a shadow cast on any object, either of the moon on the earth or of the earth on the moon. It occurs when all the three celestial objects like sun, moon and the earth comes in a straight line. So first we'll discuss solar eclipse. It occurs when the sun, moon and the earth comes in a straight line to each other, and moon comes in between the earth and the sun. Moon comes in between the sun and the earth. This case is known as solar eclipse. What happens in this case? The light which is coming from the sun is stopped by the moon. So due to this, it will cast its shadow on this part of the earth, and this part of the earth, this solar eclipse is visible. Solar eclipse is visible in the some parts of the earth, beta. Everywhere on the earth there can't be a solar eclipse. सूर्य ग्रहण कुछ कुछ जगह दिखता है, कुछ कुछ जगह नहीं दिखता बच्चे. That is because of the smaller size of moon. So due to which the shadow is cast over this part of the earth, and this part of earth can observe a solar eclipse. Next is lunar eclipse. It occurs when sun, the moon and the earth comes in a straight line, and the earth comes in between the sun and the moon, and the shadow of earth is cast over, spreads over the moon, and this shadow covers the moon. This case is known as lunar eclipse. So this light is coming from the source of light, which is sun is the source of light. This is the opaque object. It stops it, and due to which the shadow of the earth falls over the moon, and this case is known as, this kind of eclipse is known as lunar eclipse.